Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Tisky Sour. We normally have Dahlia Gabriel on a Wednesday evening, but because of an unfortunate encounter between a laptop and a pint of water, she is not able to join us tonight. But I'm joined instead by Aaron Bastani. You're always there when I need you, Aaron. Thank you for being here.
Well, where else was I going to be? I mean, my primary job's on a Wednesday are babysitting a 12-week-old French bulldog, or just just reading. So I could take a time out for you, Michael.
You haven't formed the bubble yet. We'll get onto that later in the show, I'm sure.
Fed up with that word already. Yeah.
As ever, tweet on the hashtag Tisky Sour and share the stream. We want to get more people watching this show live. On Monday's show, we discussed in depth the felling of the statue of the notorious slave trader Edward Colston and its dumping in Bristol Harbour. Me, Ash and Aaron all agreed that it was a beautiful moment. There was a real poetic justice to a slave trader getting thrown into a harbour where, he'd carried out so much of that trade. But none of us expected the ripple effects to be quite so immediate and quite so large. So in the last 48 hours since that show, Sadiq Khan has set up a commission to review statues and street names to ensure London's landmarks reflect the city's diversity. Plymouth Council has announced it will be changing the name of Sir John Hawkins Square. Hawkins is described by the Encyclopedia Britannica as the first English slave trader. And last night, Tower Hamlets Council removed a statue of the slave trader Robert Milligan from London's Docklands, which I think you're going to see now. Dramatic scenes pulled down by a JCB machine this time, not by protesters in Bristol. So back in Bristol, Colston's Girls' School has taken down its statue of Colston and is considering a name change. Liverpool University have announced they will rename their student halls, currently named after William Gladstone, due to his support for slavery. We'll talk about that final one in a bit more detail in a moment, because I think the case of Gladstone is one of the grey areas. It's not as clear cut as someone like Colston or someone like John Hawkins. But first of all, I want to go straight to you, Aaron. Have you, or can you, remember a piece of direct action in our lifetimes that's had such an immediate impact as this one?
Well, we talked about this on Twitter. The poll tax comes to mind, but that was a long campaign. That was years in the making. You had non-payment campaigns, people going to prison, and then you had the culmination of that being the poll tax riot. But in terms of a single event, I don't think anything rivals this. Perhaps you could say Millbank, if the increase in tuition fees hadn't gone ahead in December 2010, it would be similar. But clearly that didn't get the desired effect. This did. It's catalyzed something much bigger. It's catalyzed something which will have ripple effects, not both over time, but also over space. I think the implications of this go beyond Britain. We saw in Antwerp and Belgium a statue of King Leopold II come down. That wasn't started in Bristol, but obviously it was an inspiration to people beyond the UK. So no, I think this probably is the most consequential piece of direct action in living memory.
And I mean, what's so shocking about it is, I suppose, the immediacy, because we had seen, I mean, there have been, we shouldn't pretend that this campaign to remove colonial statues is new. There has been a long-standing hard-fought campaign. For example, Rhodes Must Fall in Oxford, but there was always, a quite well-organized backlash against that. And it did seem, whenever Dahlia Gabriel, our colleague, would appear on TV, there was sort of this overwhelming consensus that to take down these statues would be to rewrite history. And that was just the political common sense. And that has been smashed in the last 3 days. And to me, I find it very interesting, this kind of idea of a tipping point. So up to now, people had been opposed to this in political elites, and now suddenly everyone is piling in and saying, oh, of course we shouldn't have statues up of slave traders, but maybe someone like Gladstone is a grey area. We're going to look at, actually, let's go to a graphic of Rhodes Must Fall now, because that is a campaign that's still up and running in Oxford University. Rhodes, obviously incredibly famous colonialist, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, was named after him. He has loads of stuff named after him in Oxford, along with a particular scholarship that he initially funded. They want his statue taken down from Oriel College. I want to go on to, though, that question of the grey areas, because in the media right now, what we are seeing is people who said, "Oh, we always warned you this would be a slippery slope," and now people are talking about taking down statues of Harold Wilson. I don't know if anyone saw that controversy on Twitter today. It was, in fact, a tweet by someone from the far right. I think he was trolling, which was then taken up by a local paper, which was then retweeted by a Conservative MP saying, "This has gone mad. Now people are saying Harold Wilson should be brought down." But this was a problem of media not really checking the origin of tweets and a controversy feeding itself. But someone like William Gladstone is less of a clear-cut case. So the reason that students in Liverpool some students in Liverpool had asked for a student halls to be renamed was because early in Gladstone's career, in his maiden speech, in fact, as an MP, he stood up and defended the slave trade. His dad was a famous, very wealthy slave trader. That's where they got their money from. And then also he was sort of quite consequential in securing compensation for his father when the slave trade was abolished. Obviously, this is something people are finally talking about now, the fact that when the slave trade was abolished, it wasn't slaves who were compensated, it was their owners who were compensated by huge sums. Britain only stopped paying off it in 2015. So taxpayers of all ethnic origins have been paying back slave traders up to now. But obviously, Gladstone wasn't just someone who defended the slave trade. That was at the beginning of his career. His maiden speech was when he was 22. He was prime minister in his 80s. So he also, he started off as a Conservative MP, ended up being a prime minister in the Liberal Party, oversaw an extension of the franchise, proposed home rule in Ireland. I'm not really here to defend Gladstone's record. And I'm not really expert enough to give you is he a good guy or is he a bad guy? But Aaron, do you think once it gets to the stage that people are renaming student halls named after famous prime ministers with very long, complex records, do you think this could backfire, this example?
I think so. It's for the relevant people to decide what they want to call the building. The trustees of an organisation, what would be called, in the sort of bureaucratic term, stakeholders. In this instance, staff, management, students. But if you're gonna do that to Gladstone, be prepared to do it to Clement Attlee as well, because the Labour government 1945 to 1950 did not have clean hands when it came to foreign policy. So I'd be interested to know where you want to draw the line. And in fact, you could implicate every single British prime minister, Labour and Conservative, in some quite underhand dealings. Harold Wilson, Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair. So I'm not so sure. Even somebody like a Winston Churchill or a Nelson, I think this is something we've got to have as a debate on the show. I think it's such an important debate. And that's not to say I think I'm right. It's just my opinion. Is that something like Nelson or Churchill have played such a huge role in the country's national life, for better and worse, that I think that has to be reflected in national commemoration. It always will be, whether that's the name of a road or schools or statues. And I think it would be myopic to say, well, we have to get rid of all those people too. I think you have to look for the points of consensus. And I think slave traders clearly should not be lionized in a 21st century liberal democracy. 35% of kids in primary schools are from BME backgrounds. People say this is our history. Well, it's not their history. Or if it is their history, it's the complete opposite of the kind of history they would wish to commemorate. So there is the grey area. But, we don't need to necessarily focus on that too much, because there's also a great deal of figures that we could probably agree on. Before we get to Gladstone, I'd say there's a couple of thousand people you could quite easily point to first.
Exactly. And I suppose my opinion on this is not particularly original or new, but I think if they are famous, if the main thing they're famous for is colonialism or slavery, we should not have a statue up for them. A statue it's not just to remember history, it is to say, they played an important role in this, in the creation of this country or whatever. And one that we think has some good parts. And someone like Colston and someone like Rhodes, definitely those statues should not be up. For someone like Churchill, who had, there's things on the good side of the ledger, which is that he helped, or he had a role in defeating Hitler and the Nazis, and some awful things on the other side of the ledger, support for colonialism, the Bengal famine. I think people like that, the statue should probably remain. But I'd propose, having a really quite detailed plaque underneath, which explained the complex history of that character, which was agreed between historians from diverse backgrounds, etc. Maybe even bringing in historians who are currently working in Indian universities to have a discussion about what should be on that plaque. And I think I think that's right, just for moral reasons, but also this argument that statues help us understand history. I have to admit, and I'm someone I'm interested in history. I don't think I've ever learned anything from a statue. I didn't know, Nelson's column, how many times I've been to Trafalgar Square. I barely know what he did. So I feel like this whole debate, if one thing we get out of it is that under these big statues who, basically, let's face it, no one knows who any of these people are. Well, obviously Winston, the famous ones people know, but most statues you see around, people don't know who they are. If there was a move by historians, in collaboration with local councils to make sure that underneath these things was a genuinely interesting, contentious piece of writing explaining the background, I think that would, only be a positive thing. Aaron, I want to throw this back to you though, because there are, this is now a politically contentious issue, and I've seen, on Twitter, people who I respect sort of saying, this could go in one of two directions. So either, like we can have a really broad, useful discussion about Britain's, imperial legacy, come to terms with the racism that this society hasn't addressed whatsoever. But there's also a risk that it becomes, a kind of culture war, which ends up consolidating support for the centre right when the government are currently on the ropes due to their response to coronavirus. Obviously, I don't really want. I'm not expecting you to say which one will happen, but what do you think are the sort of developments which will determine which direction this particular political moment goes in?
Well, I've just seen. I just want to quickly respond to. There's a comment here saying something. Ask Ash about the Bengal famine. Churchill was significantly responsible for a famine during the Second World War, which impacted people in South Asia. But like I said at the beginning, we as a country, as a society, we're going to have to say, well, what kinds of figures do we want elevated? In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, the Dutch try and retake the Dutch East Indies, today Indonesia, by force. They tried to recolonize it. That was done with the help of the British under Clement Attlee. Nye Bevan was a member of the cabinet. So, it's very easy for the left. There are the easy figures. But if you want to take this logic to its conclusion, you are going to also have to say the same ultimately for Clement Attlee. I think you're probably going to have to say the same for Harold Wilson. You're going to have to say the same for a Labour cabinet, which did things like, for instance, introduce legalised homosexuality. That same cabinet oversaw some really bad foreign policy decisions. So, the same cabinet that was responsible for the NHS was responsible for the completely unnecessary continuation of British Empire after 1945 for several years. People forget this. I think it was Ian MacLeod, a Conservative MP. He was really the central figure, actually, in terms of decolonization in Britain. He thought this was a good thing to do for Britain. He was a Conservative. So it's going to be a bit more complicated than people think. And that doesn't mean that we stop things. It doesn't mean people shouldn't protest. Like I said, it's just my personal opinion. But I think you need a holistic solution. And I think it would look like something akin to a Truth and Reconciliation commission. It would have people from the Global South. It would have the ancestors of people that were subject to genocide, etc. And there would be a general discussion about remittances, about historical acknowledgement, apologies, and so on. That would be my sort of demand as a country. Let's do that. Now, you don't need that to get rid of statues of slave traders. But if you're going to say that William Gladstone, Churchill, and I think by extension, logically, people like Clement Attlee, if you're going to say, well, we need to sort of erase their memory from the public ledger, I think you're going to need a big public buy-in. You can't have 25%, 35% of the population saying that should happen. It's not going to be plausible, because there are other people out there. That's how politics works. They disagree with you. And people think slavery is wrong because a lot of persuasion went into that, right? That's why you have the cause of abolitionism. It was a contentious subject for a very long time. And today, of course, everybody says, well, slavery is obviously wrong. You had that debate. We haven't had the debate as a country as to why Winston Churchill shouldn't be commemorated. And people on the left will have to acknowledge that. And so if we haven't had that debate, if we haven't even had the attempt to persuade, that's actually now beginning to happen, which is fantastic. But if we haven't had that long period of attempting to persuade people, I don't just think you can sort of steamroll them. Now, with Colston, like I say, we all acknowledge slavery was wrong. So that's kind of simple. Gladstone, his father owned 2,500 slaves. Like you said, like many liberals at the time, actually, it's often overlooked, he backed the Confederacy. Because, yes, individual liberty is a kind of central sort of pillar of 19th century liberalism, but so is the right to national self-determination. And a lot of liberals, like Gladstone, said, well, the Confederacy is an independent nation. We're going to recognize it, just like we recognize other sort of, liberal nationalist movements. So it's a bit more complex than that. I mean, my instinct would be, I don't care. I'm not going to go back for Gladstone. I'm not going to go back for Churchill. But if you were in a room and it really upset 50% of people, and you said, well, look, we can get consensus on dealing with all this other stuff, maybe getting some form of reparations to the global south, having some way of, renovating an institution like the Commonwealth for the 21st century, then I think that would be preferable rather than starting a culture war over Winston Churchill. Again, that's just my view. Winston Churchill did some really objectionable things. I can completely understand why somebody would want to remove any inkling of Winston Churchill from our cultural memory.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I think we're going to just look at one more statue getting removed. This is someone who undoubtedly does deserve to get removed. King Leopold, who was responsible for one of the most brutal examples of colonialism in the Congo. This is the statue was. This happened, I think, actually before. Well, it was removed after Colston was Belgium. This is in Belgium. It was removed after. I've lost my train of thought.
Was this Antwerp or where was this?
Yeah, it's in Antwerp. Sorry, I've got my thought back. This was removed after Colston was thrown into the harbour, but it was burnt beforehand. And I suppose on a really mundane level, Aaron, did you know that you can burn statues?
I had no idea. Do they douse it in kerosene, or how did that work?
I don't know how you burn a statue.
The stone, well, you can't. It has really high temperature to burn at. I mean, this guy again, it's like Colston. Although here's an interesting thought, Leopold II, the Democratic Republic of Congo only got independence in 1960. And that was immediately sabotaged by Belgian mining companies. Because even today, the mineral wealth in the Democratic Republic of Congo, second largest country in Africa after Algeria. It's huge in terms of surface area, huge natural resources. And the Belgians weren't going to leave there easily. The southern province, I think it's called Katanga, has huge mineral resources. So what they did was, it's a secessionist movement. We're going to back them. But what was really appalling, actually, was the UN got involved and also effectively helped remove the democratic elected government immediately after the departure of the Belgian sort of colonial apparatus. And they tried to, this was neo-colonialism, right? Now, what's interesting is that's only 60 years ago. And we're not talking about the statue being removed in Congo, in Kinshasa. That's the statue of Leopold II, who they were saying is this great guy, in the heart of empire, being brought down. It's only 60 years ago, Patrice Lumumba is removed by an apparatus overseen significantly by the Belgian government of the day, revering people like Leopold II. Their successors that govern Belgium today are removing the statue of Leopold II for these appalling misdeeds that were done in his name. There's a great book about him. Owen Jones recommended the other day, Adam Hochschild, I think, which is about effectively probably the worst atrocity of the 19th century was committed by the Belgians in Congo.
We've got a great tweet on the hashtag TiskiSour. Tom Brooks says, maybe these men who donated money to their cities for statues did so in the hope they might be remembered as great philanthropists, not slave traders. I think that's such an important point. I mean, what people who were defending the Colston people said, but he also funded schools, but he also funded, what else? Cultural facilities or whatever. But I mean, precisely the reason he did do that was probably to whitewash the actual role that he played in the world, which was as a slave trader. So, I mean, it's philanthropist is not a defense of someone. They are a philanthropist because they're trying to whitewash their actual role in the world.
Yeah. What does that tell us about philanthropy? I've often been critical of philanthropy and charity. Charity is a little bit different. Philanthropy, which is effectively an act of charity done by somebody who's extraordinarily wealthy. It tells us something quite significant, I think, about the act of philanthropy itself, that so many of these people, it turns out, philanthropists tend to be making huge amounts, not all of them, but tend to be making huge amounts of money under conditions of exploitation and grotesque inequality. And I think you're right. There's an intention there, which is for the spoils of that to kind of conceal the sins which made it possible in the first place.
We're going to go on to our next story. We're going to come back later in the show to a sort of related story of Britain coming to terms with its more recent past in this case, which is going to be about Little Britain being removed from iPlayer and the freakouts that have sort of resulted from that happening. But we're going to move on to today's story from today. So Boris Johnson gave today's press conference, and ever since he soberly announced that many of our loved ones would die back in March, he refuses to stand up and speak to the public unless he has some good news to deliver. I think he's trying to, suppress that particular collective memory we all have. One was saved up for him today, a bit of good news he could give to the country. Let's take a look.
But there are too many people, still too many people, particularly those who live by themselves, who are lonely and struggling with being unable to see friends and family. So from this weekend, we will allow single adult households, so adults living alone or single parents with children under 18, to form a support bubble with one other household. All those in a support bubble will be able to act as if they live in the same household, meaning they can spend time together inside each other's homes and do not need to stay 2 meters apart.
So if anyone was following Twitter whilst this press conference was taking place, you'll know that how this announcement was understood by many is that shagging is back on. So people have been for weeks asking, what are you supposed to do if you don't live with your partner, given that you have to stay 2 meters apart from everyone? This finally seems to be one of the answers, but there is a catch. Let's take a look at what he says next.
I want to stress that support bubbles must be exclusive, meaning you can't switch the household you are in a bubble with or connect with multiple households.
So it's not quite the moment for you to transform all of those low-level Tinder chats you've been having into full-blown dates. You've got to choose, which one of those chats you want to pursue, because they're the only person you're going to be allowed to, get within 2 meters of for potentially the next 10 months. Who knows? I think Ash Sarkar, our colleague, put the complexities of what's just been announced very well today on Twitter. I'm just going to read this out before going to you, Aaron. So can we get this up? Public service announcement. New rules mean, I think, that if you want to bone someone, you've got to make sure that either you both live alone or your housemates are also shagging their housemates, only shagging each other, or nobody's housemates are shagging or anybody. Nobody's housemates are shagging anybody. Aaron, what do you make of this new announcement from Boris Johnson? Do you think he'll see a bump in his approval ratings, which have been, sliding catastrophically for the past few weeks?
Well, British politics, British political life just feels like a sequence of random words that the right-wing press and the Conservatives kind of pick on, and that we all then have to repeat ad infinitum for the next several weeks. One is, frictionless. Nobody talked about frictionless trade until 2019. Now, bubble. If you're going to do Google Trends for the word bubble in the UK over the next 2 weeks, it's gonna increase by 1,000%. And I think these kind of everyday words, but being applied in a quite technical sense in regards to dealing with a pandemic, which is what we are still in, I think the ideological purpose it serves here is you understand what's going on here, because of course we hear the word bubble all the time, but you don't really have any idea what's going on because you have no real understanding of what the word bubble is meant to refer to or the consequentiality of it. So, and there are dozens of words like this in British politics. They become a faddish word that the entire sort of press corps and the Tory front bench just say for 3 months, and then we never hear it again. I suspect bubble will be one of them.
I'm going to put, I suppose, my neck out and say I actually think this is quite a good announcement. So, and I actually think it's long overdue, and that's because for this whole period since the beginning of lockdown, people who live alone have not been able to, according to the law, get within 2 meters of anyone else, right? And, for a long time, they weren't able to see anyone else, even at a distance. And I think that has meant that the lockdown on people who live alone has been, incredibly painful, awful. I live with someone. I can't imagine being on my own for quite that long a period of time. And I think the modelers, the Neil Fergusons of the world. I think that one of their assumptions was that if people live alone, they'll just break the rules. But I think what that doesn't take into account is that, some people, especially if you're living alone, you might, people who are living alone often end up getting kind of mental health problems. And if you're a bit paranoid, you're like, you don't want to break the rules, And so I think that the government have finally given a way for people who live alone to have some proper company, get within 2 meters of each other, is very good. It does make this idea of the bubble, in a way, it's good scientific communication, because if people do take this on board properly, the idea that you twin 2 households is not a bad one. But the caveat I will add is that whilst this is a decent announcement, which should have happened weeks ago, I think we shouldn't let this announcement take away from what was more significant today. And I think the most significant thing that happened today was that Neil Ferguson, the top modeler I mentioned earlier, he spoke in front of the Commons Science Committee. And he said, had we introduced lockdown measures a week earlier, we would have reduced the final death toll by at least a half. So as we know, the excess deaths at this point in time have been 60,000 people. So government incompetence in that period of time has meant that 30,000 people have died. And you can say, look, the benefit of hindsight, everything's easy with the benefit of hindsight. If you look at when that, what that week, the dates that applied to, on this show, we were saying, why not just do it? We don't know for sure what is going to be, the overall long-term best thing to do. But the precautionary principle would say lockdown now, find out afterwards whether or not that's exactly the right thing to do. They didn't do that. They sat on their hands. From that period, we saw, articles. There was an article in the FT saying that the reason they hadn't locked down London is because they didn't want to give, bad messages to international finance. And we now know that's led to loads of deaths. It also means actually, in fact, that Britain is probably going to have one of the biggest economic hits of any country, because whilst they delayed the lockdown to try and keep our economy moving, it ended up being completely self-defeating, because the later you go into a lockdown, the later you have to come out of it, because it takes ages. If you get your numbers up, if you get your disease numbers up to that high, it takes longer to take them down again. The conclusion obviously being that if only the government had listened to our hipster analysis, then we might not be in this mess. I shouldn't say our hipster analysis. There were loads of people in that period of time who were saying what the government are currently doing makes no sense, but they were ignored. Aaron, your thoughts on what Neil Ferguson said to the Commons Science Committee today?
Well, I think you shouldn't sort of do yourself down, Michael. I think you were one of very few voices who were very, very, very strong on this very early on. And there was this kind of weird period of like 2 weeks where it was clear that, about a week really, where we knew we were going to have a lockdown, and the government was just not really doing it. And Boris Johnson was going, we know that the curve's now the curve is about to go up. And it's like, well, if we know the curve's about to go up, and we know that, people talk about exponential growth all the time, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. Literally the only place, or well, almost literally the only place this can be observed in the natural world is with viruses. So it's a really dangerous game to start playing. We're going to oversee the growth of the virus. And we're like, what? Just shut things down now. Similarly, we're in 2 weeks, we're going to tell everybody on public transport, you're going to have to wear a face mask. Yeah. Okay. Well, if it's going to help, if it's going to make a difference, why not say do it tomorrow? Right? I mean, what's the worst that can happen? Tesco, M&S, Asda are going to say, we can make loads of money here. Just plonk them by the tills, right? Or people, be selling them in streets. I mean, what's the problem? So I agree with you, but again, it's one of those things, flattening the curve. It has real scientific content, but like bubble, I think it probably diminished the conversation around what an effective response would be rather than help it. The idea of a bubble, maybe it makes sense, but it just, and you're saying it's effective scientific communication. I mean, maybe I've just got a grudge against these people. Also important to say, actually, in terms of how many lives were saved from the lockdown, there was a study by Imperial College 2 days ago which said that 3 million lives were saved across Europe because of the lockdown. So when people say, was it really worth it? We've unemployment's gone up, and you've seen, all kinds of negative things happening. Yes, this was all preferable to 3 million people dying in Europe. Yes, absolutely. And believe me, you would absolutely think that if one of them was a member of your family or a close friend.
We've got nearly 2,000 people watching. Let's make sure we get that over 2K while we're still going live. So share the show link. We've got a really important comment from John Hamlet with a £10 super chat. Thank you very much. John says, I live alone. I haven't seen anyone since March. My mental health has gone south dramatically. I'm now finding it pretty hard to even look people in the eye when I'm out shopping. Stay strong, friends. Stay strong, John. I have to say, I know many people, close friends, who are sort of in a very similar situation. And I do think that people who live alone have been, somewhat overlooked during this particular crisis. So solidarity to you. I hope, soon you start feeling more comfortable looking at people in the eyes. I'm hoping that we'll all be able to see each other a bit more fairly soon. Our next story is about schools. The government have this week backed down on plans for all primary school children to return to schools before the summer holidays. I thought this was a good opportunity to get NEU officer and primary school teacher James McCash back on the show. We had him on a couple of weeks ago. He laid out the union objections to the government's plans. So I started earlier today by asking him whether this announcement from the government is a victory for his union.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a victory for the unions and for the parents and for the local councils that have organised against the government's reckless plans. The government's been first defied and then defeated. On June the 1st, the government wanted all primary schools to open up to nursery reception year 1 and year 6 children. The DfE have just released the data saying that by the Wednesday, a few days later, only 52% of those schools eligible to reopen had done so. I mean, I think the fact they chose to use data from a few days later shows that probably on that first day, the majority did not open at all. People defied the government because ultimately they had more faith in the NEU and other trade unions than they did in the state itself. I think that's a huge victory. So after that defiance, we then got defeat. The government wanted all schools, all primary schools, to open for all year groups by June the 15th. Which is next Monday. They've now said that's not going to happen. I mean, the plans for June the 1st were bad, but the plans for June the 15th were completely bonkers. They wanted to have children in smaller groups than normally, just like they are right now. So instead of 30, maybe 10 or 15. And at the moment that works because there's 3 year groups coming into a school that normally has 8. So there are more classrooms available. How that would work when all children are back is very difficult to see. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to work out that if you have smaller classes, then you either need to have fewer children or more classrooms. They wanted the same number of children and they had no plans whatsoever to create new classrooms or requisition new classrooms. So absolutely, yeah, the government has been defeated by the unions, by parents and by local authorities.
And so obviously, yeah, this is a victory for the teaching unions. You don't think it was safe for kids to go back at the 1st of June or for more kids to go back in the middle of this month. But it does seem, it is worrying if kids are missing out on this much education. And I suppose parents and children would be reassured if there could at least be a guarantee that they can go back to school in September. I mean, how confident are you that all students will be able to go back to school in September? Or do you think we're going to have a very similar row just a few months down the line?
I mean, absolutely. The position that kind of I've taken, that most teachers have taken, that the NEU has taken, is that we want children back in school. I mean, this is the longest period with no compulsory schooling for 150 years since compulsory schooling was introduced in England and Wales in 1870. That's a real problem. That's something that I'm very, very concerned by. And what's going to happen now is we're going to be arguing that the government needs to put more in place to make it safe for schools to reopen and to address this huge issue amongst predominantly working class kids who are missing out on their schooling. And what's going to happen there is the government's going to accuse us of hypocrisy. But it's not hypocrisy at all. I mean, if we were making a cake together and you started kind of doing it haphazardly and not measuring things out properly and using salt instead of sugar and throwing in lots of soil into the mix, then when the cake comes out, it would be an absolute disaster. And if I'd been complaining about you doing it wrong, I'd start saying, well, we need to start again. We need to make a new cake. And you could then say, well, that's hypocritical. You told me to stop making the cake before, and now you're telling me to start. But it's not, because the cake you made was made of dirt, and the plans the government made are made of dirt as well. So we do need children to be back in school soon. The government have wasted, frankly, quite a lot of time in their daft, reckless plans for this month, and we need plans in place for schools to be able to reopen more widely in September. Am I confident that we'll have all children back in September? Sadly not. I mean, the crucial factor here is the amount of space. And unless the government is willing to increase the amount of space available by requisitioning new buildings or building new classrooms, then it's simply not going to be possible to have huge numbers of children back in school until the virus is much more controlled than it is now. So, I mean, September will be good. I hope a lot more children in September. But can I guarantee that all children back in September? No, I don't think so. I think, frankly, it sounds to me like a lot of local authorities are working towards a much later date and saying it might not be till January that all children are back.
That was primary school teacher James McCashin, officer at the National Education Union and also a Labour councillor in South London. Over the last 2 weeks, the world's attention has been on racist and violent policing in the United States. But don't be under any illusion that Britain does not have some similar problems. 2 videos emerged in the last 24 hours showing how black men are treated by our law enforcement. So the first video was shared on Twitter by the rapper, singer and songwriter Wretch32. He captioned the video saying, "This is how the police think they can treat a 62-year-old man in Tottenham, but this one happens to be my dad." Let's take a look.
I'm not resisting. Don't touch me. Social distancing. Please don't touch me. Millard!
Move now. Police officer with taser. Move.
What the hell?
Police officer with taser. Stay where you are. Stay where you are. Police officer with taser.
Oh my god!
Stay still. Stay still. You okay? Listen to me. Are you okay? Can you hear me?
No!
Stay still, sir.
Stay still. Stay still.
They've tasered him! They've tasered him!
Stay still. Stay still.
So you can see they're really distressing footage of the police tasering a 62-year-old man who then falls down the stairs. He could be seriously, or could have been seriously injured. We'll go to Wretch32's response in a moment. First of all, this is what the Metropolitan Police said about the situation. So they said they went to the home as part of a long-running operation to tackle drug supply linked to serious violence. As officers entered the premises, a man came downstairs and started moving towards an officer. Suddenly, he was ordered to remain where he was, but continued towards officers who, after several warnings, deployed a taser. The man was not arrested, but was assessed by the London Ambulance Service at the scene. He did not require further medical treatment. They go on to say that a 22-year-old in the house was arrested and charged for encouraging someone else to commit an offence, and the police maintain there is no evidence of misconduct. But it does seem hard to, understand how tasering a 62-year-old man at the top of the stairs, he's not a suspect in any way, can be, reasonable actions by the police. That's also certainly what Miller Scott, who is Wretch32's father, thinks. He said he would not have been tasered, or he believes he would not have been tasered were he white. And let's take a look now at what Wretch himself had to say to ITV News last night.
I've grown up in a household with my dad and my uncle, and I've watched them fight against police brutality my whole life. I'm 35 now, and we're still here again today. And I now have to have the same conversations that my dad and my uncle and my grandparents and my parents had with me when I was a child. That means there's no progression.
I want to now go to one more video that has emerged this week, this time of a black man being stopped by Cambridgeshire police. Let's take a look at that.
Right, I've got to go to quite a serious incident. The reason I stopped you is when you came out of the barns. No offence to you, but you're a black male, okay? I'm not going to lie to you.
So it's racist when you stop me.
I'm not saying that at all. The reason I've stopped you, I'll explain if you let me finish. All right. In this area, we have a number of drug dealers. I'm not saying you're a drug dealer. That come up from other areas that don't live anywhere around here.
I live here.
I know you might know that, but I don't, because I've never met you before. Okay, so the reason I've stopped you is because I haven't seen you before, and I've been a local officer for a long time here. So I've turned round, and then when we came out to Kings Avenue, your car had disappeared.
So now that video was actually taken 5 years ago, but it's quite interesting that it was only shared this week for the first time. It's now been seen by about 3 million people, and I think what that latter one shows is that we often think the reason why people are, now aware of police violence is because, or it wasn't violence in that case, it was racism. It is because, of the prevalence of cameras. But what's also changed is an understanding of what people will pay attention to, because that film's existed for 5 years, but the person who filmed it didn't think it was, worthwhile sharing it, and now it's getting completely, loads of attention. It's been seen 3 million times on Twitter, been shared by tens of thousands of people on Facebook, and now the Cambridgeshire police are having to answer for what happened. Aaron, I want to get your take on both videos and what they both show about this current moment, and what you interpret as to what's going on here.
Well, a few things. I mean, firstly, thank God the British police, by and large, don't have firearms. They increasingly are equipped with tasers. Tasers were originally meant to be deployed in a very limited way. That's changed really significantly. It's an increasingly ubiquitous feature now. You'll be on a perfectly peaceful protest, for instance, and see a couple of officers with tasers. And tasers can kill people. Not necessarily highly unusual, but they can be fatal weapons. They're far more dangerous, for instance, than even a baton. They're very dangerous.
Especially if you shoot someone at the top of the stairs. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, no, especially an elderly person. They shouldn't be used lightly. Somebody with a heart condition or a pacemaker, for instance. It's perfectly possible you're going to kill them. And that in no way was appropriate force. The person quite clearly wasn't a danger. I mean, there was just no reason. They're saying it's a drugs issue around drugs. If there's the person they're accosting, harassing, I think is a better word to put it. Do they have a violent history, etc.? I mean, none of that was the case here. Not that I think that would, vindicate them, but none of the things you'd expect. There should be a little tick box here, and I think actually policing by tick boxes is exactly the opposite of what we should be asking for. None of those boxes were there, and I think it does ask very, very serious questions. Why do police believe they could behave like this? Because there are no consequences. That's genuinely what happens. There are no consequences. A few years ago, I was arrested on a protest outside SOAS. We were protesting at David Willetts. And a friend of mine at the time, he was arrested and he'd done nothing wrong. And so they went to arrest him, and I just went to pull him away, hoping, they would sort of leave him alone. And then so he got arrested, assaulting a police officer. And then I was arrested also for obstructing an arrest. This went to court. We were in Highbury Magistrates Court on the day of the police officer who was going to, give a spoken testimony. On the day, my co-defendant's lawyer submitted, thank God, he was American. He was an American national. He would have been deported. He was doing a PhD at Oxford University, brown guy. He would have had everything taken away from him. Thankfully, somebody recorded this, showing he had his hands up. He in no way was doing anything that the police officer said. It completely brought into dispute his entire statement. We showed this, or they showed this to the prosecution, the relevant parties, and they said, okay, well, we're going to pull out from this. Now, there was a police officer who was willing to lie and destroy somebody's life for nothing. And there's going to be no consequences for that. Nothing's going to happen. I think he was disciplined. I think he maybe afterwards was briefly suspended. By the way, and the only reason why this has all happened, the guy who managed to collate all the evidence, get the good solicitor, etc., is because even though he was BAME, he was a privileged guy. He was a PhD student. Do you think a 19-year-old kid who's working full-time, who's got enough on their plate, could they have organised all that? Probably not. Would they have had the access, the resources to mobilise a defence case like that? Probably not. Their life would have been torn apart. And the general problem is there are no consequences. And that's why they behave like this, because they believe they can do it with impunity. And I would say it's not just a race thing. This is not just white officers doing this to brown and actually more often black people. We know, as we were talking to Alex Vitale a few weeks ago, last week on Novara Media, American forces with large numbers of black police officers are just as bad, if not worse. This is about a structural racism within these police forces. And that has to be addressed. There need to be consequences for treating people of colour differently to the rest of the population, which is precisely what happens both here and in the United States.
I think that point you make about thank God our police don't have firearms is a really important one, because I think sometimes people mischaracterize the difference between American policing and British policing by saying, our police are less racist than theirs. And if you look at, for example, the prison system, our prison system is more disproportionate in terms of the number of black people who are there compared to the number of white people compared to the overall population. But what does seem to be the case is our police are less violent. So racism from what I've seen, seems to be just as big a problem in our police, if potentially more. I mean, if you look at that video where the police officer hadn't seemed to even consider the fact that stopping someone precisely because they're black is racist. It seemed like he genuinely thought that there was nothing wrong with racially profiling someone. He just thought that, he thought, if I explain to the guy I'm racially profiling him, he'll obviously accept it was a reasonable thing to do. Like, what that shows is a complete, a failure to ever think about what racism is in Britain more broadly. But
can I come back to you on that?
Thank God more of them don't have guns.
Can I come back to you on that, Michael? I mean, often you see police officers, for instance, their last Friday and stuff, which they're not meant to do. There is a set of conditions which have to be met for them to be asked to see ID, and often they don't know the law that they are applying in order to make people do certain things. We saw that, for instance, with the ambulance driver who had done nothing wrong and he was being perfectly cooperative, and then he was arrested by a white female police officer. Often this is not about the imposition of the law. This is often it's an interpersonal confrontation between a police officer and a citizen, and the police officer just generally wants them to do what they want them to do, and often they are breaking the law in doing what they're doing. And this is a really important thing. You have to know your rights. If you don't know your rights, you have no chance. And I say this with complete conviction. Record what happens. No comment. Be polite. And if they break the law, if they behave in this manner, as they've done with the father of Wretch 32 or with my friend that time outside the School of Oriental and African Studies, you will be compensated. They work on the basis that most people don't know their rights. Really, really, really critically important. Know your rights.
We are going to return to Britain's newfound interest in reevaluating its cultural output. Probably the most prominent debate we've seen since the felling of Colston in Bristol is which other statues should fall down. But obviously, problems with Britain's cultural output when it comes to race, ethnicity, and racism isn't just condemned to the distant past and when big bronze structures were erected in city centres. This problem, racism, is also much more recent. An example of this is Little Britain, which was, I think, probably BBC's most popular comedy output in the noughties between 2003 and 2007. This Tuesday, the BBC announced they were going to withdraw Little Britain from iPlayer. The reason they're doing this is because Little Britain has rightly become controversial because the two main actors in it, Matt Lucas and David Walliams, frequently wear blackface. It's always difficult to understand how recent this was. You had Matt Lucas in blackface on the sequel to this series, Come Fly With Me, in 2010. Let's actually look at, we've got some of these images. So this is David Williams, because it is quite shocking. Can we get David Williams up as a black woman there? That's in the first series, so between 2003 and 2007. And then we've got Matt Lucas in Come Fly With Me in 2010. So recent. But yeah, the BBC have taken them down. We're going to look at someone's reaction in a moment. But first of all, someone who's not particularly pleased with what's going on. But first of all, I'm going to go to you, Aaron. What do you think about this? Was this the right decision from the BBC?
I've never watched it. I have no idea.
You've never watched Little Britain?
I've probably watched a flash. I've never made an attempt to watch it for a prolonged period of time. No, I mean, the idea that a grown adult male would dress up as a black woman for comedy in 2010. I mean, obviously ever is ridiculous, but it's just, and this is me wearing my sort of Iranian dad hat. He's well educated, and by the way, what that tells us is, this doesn't in any way immunize people from behaving like racist idiots, especially, in the form of comedy or irony or satire. Just nuts. Who commissioned that? I mean, has that ever entered your head as a joke to dress up as a black woman? What the hell? It's just. I honestly can't understand. I can't comprehend the mindset that thinks like that. Personally,
well, it wasn't just race. I think it is important that you say that. David Walliams, at least, I don't know what Matt Lucas's background is, but privileged fella, and so much of that show was, basically punching down. Completely taking the piss out of working class people in Britain and people of color in Britain without sort of any, self-reflection about the fact that they were two white guys in very privileged positions in this country, and they didn't really mock anyone who was rich and powerful. They mocked people who basically the tabloids were already mocking.
Yeah.
That was they piled in on what was actually quite an ugly cultural moment generally. But we are going to take a look at the reaction, to this news from Darren Grimes. Now, we mentioned him also on Monday's show because he was the person who gave the misleading tweet where he mistook some traffic lights for a Black Lives Matter protester when he blamed protesters for having dismounted an officer from their horse, when in fact it was that the police officer had gone into a lamppost. But he's always on the TV screens. Anyway, he uploaded a selfie video of his reaction to the BBC removing Little Britain from iPlayer.
Millions of people used to watch Little Britain and enjoy Little Britain. Not all of them mindless, bigoted racists, which is what the implication of deleting it says. First they came for the statues and I didn't speak out because I didn't care. Then they came for the comedians and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a comedian. And then they came for those that they deem racists and I didn't speak out because I'm not a racist. Then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me. That's the position that we're in. Let's get real. This is terrifying. We need to stop paying for the BBC, and our politicians ought to stand up against this madness and stop pandering to those committing crimes and those trying to rewrite history. It's a terrifying assault on our history and our minds.
I had to be honest, the bit I quite liked there. Obviously, we're gonna go into what's wrong with what he said. But when he said first they came for the statues, and I didn't say anything because I didn't care. I thought actually he delivered that quite well. But obviously, the video's fucking dumb, right? I mean, for a start, this idea that the BBC taking this off iPlayer calls everyone who ever enjoyed Little Britain a racist is ridiculous. You say, Aaron, that you never watched it. I have to admit, I watched Little Britain when I was presumably a teenager at the time, and I found it funny. The fact that I found Little Britain funny in the noughties doesn't mean I'm racist. It means that at that period of time, I was pretty ignorant about racism. And, it was good that I got educated in between then and now. But I think to see the BBC removing this from iPlayer as a judgment on me personally, it's just such a self-absorbed reaction to this. And then obviously on the more serious, profound level, I mean, he's playing there, or he's modifying the famous poem by what's his name? Who wrote that poem? Niemöller, by Niemöller, which was about Nazi persecution of ethnic minorities, and he's made it about racism, like racists.
Socialists. Yeah.
First they came for the racists. Let's get up the original poem. First they came for the socialists and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me. So then they came for the racists doesn't really fit very well as an adaptation of that poem. Aaron, what's your take on Grimes's intervention?
Yeah, so the Niemöller poem takes place in a really important context. You have the Enabling Act 1933. You have the Reichstag fire, which was apparently started by a member of the Communist Party, I think KPD. I mean, we don't really know that. A guy called, I think, von der Lubbe. That was used as a kind of pretext for closing down political dissent. What then happens is the first concentration camp is Dachau, and the people that go into that actually are communists. And so we are talking about political rivals being put into concentration camps, being executed en masse, later being joined by trade unionists, anybody that really dissents politically, and then gypsies, homosexuals, people with disabilities, Jews. The idea that you would compare that to Little Britain being taken off of iPlayer is so unbelievably stupid that it really makes you think, why is this gentleman on the BBC as regularly as he is? I mean, it's such a trite, pathetic, ignorant thing to say, which is so evidently incorrect and distasteful. It's if that came up on my Facebook feed and it was somebody's friend of a friend, I would say, what a fucking idiot. He's given a national platform every week. And look, the BBC can platform who they like. My point is, this is so stupid and is such an unserious contribution. You know, people, even he doesn't really care. It's so half-assed. You know, he reminded me, the way he delivered it, kind of reminded me of George W. Bush. He goes, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, then shame on you again. And it was kind of, he wasn't quite sure what he was saying. I mean, my God, come on. Have a bit of decorum. Say, I don't really agree with this particular. You know, we can do that. We can do that. We're adults. You can say, I'm not quite sure about this. You know, we said we're not quite sure about Gladstone compared, for instance, to Colston. I think that's fine. Yeah, clearly, Little Britain. Nobody's saying that David Walliams is the same as a slave trader. Nobody's saying that. It's about proportionality. The question is, as a society, what do we find acceptable? And also, furthermore, for the BBC, for the values it claims to want to uphold, what does it want to have on its platform? That's up to the BBC. You know, all these free market capitalists are obsessed with private enterprises or independent organizations being able to choose and decide what they want to do. That's up to the BBC ultimately. It's up to their trustees, up to their management, it's up to their staff and so on. So pathetic is one word to describe it, really.
We're about to move from one over-promoted, I was going to say bigot, but maybe I don't know enough about Darren Grimes to say that. I can say that about the next guy. But before we do that, give this video a like. And more importantly, make sure you subscribe to our channel. I want to get to over 100,000 subscribers by the end of the summer. Next story. The Black Lives Matter movement has brought to attention racism in our policing, in the way we remember history, and in our society at large. It's also shining a light on the racism that's been ignored in our mainstream press for far too long. So a shocking example of this was highlighted by journalist Afua Hirsch, who on Tuesday shared a clip of an exchange she had with LBC's Nick Ferrari on an episode of Sky's The Pledge. Let's take a look.
All over the world, statues are coming down. In just the last couple of weeks, New York has removed from Central Park the statue of a doctor who tortured enslaved black women. India has brought down Lenin, and Canadians have defaced statues of Queen Victoria. In Britain, Bristol has agreed to rename its famous music hall, removing the name of Edward Colston, one of the nation's most prolific slave traders. Now it's time to take a long, hard look at other hugely problematic figures we continue to glorify, such as Horatio Nelson, Cecil Rhodes, and yes, Winston Churchill. I'm not saying we should necessarily bring them down. Take a deep breath, everyone. But all options should be on the table. As the global movement to re-question our so-called heroes shows, the thing that's clear is this. Doing nothing, burying our heads in the sand, and hoping this debate will go away is simply no longer an option. Hi, Nick.
Afua, I really like you, but I wonder if I can remind you of some words you wrote concerning Britain.
Please do.
Britain. We have moved on from this era no more than the US from its slavery and segregationist past. The difference is that America is now in the midst of a frenzied debate on what to do about it, whereas Britain, in our inertia, arrogance and intellectual laziness, is not.
I don't write half bad, do I?
Well, you could have been a bit snappier, but I won't worry about subbing it. I'm delighted you do. Why do you stay in this country? If you take such offence when you see Nelson's column, if you take such offence when you hear Winston Churchill's name, who I would argue, if in the unlikely event that anybody want to have a poll, I would say probably 80 to 90% of people would say that Winston Churchill did a good thing. I'm delighted that I see you at these Thursdays. I'm delighted you upstairs. But if it offends you so much, how do you manage to stay here?
I find that a really strange thing to say. So there's nothing in Britain that bothers you?
Sure, but I don't want to pull it down.
Why is leaving an option?
But I don't want to pull it down.
This is my country. And the reason that I raise this critique is not because...
I mean, that is so shocking and outrageous to say, why do you stay here? Would he have said that to a white person? No. Important to recognize that. I mean, that video, like one of the ones we showed, for example, of the police racism earlier, that's a clip from a couple of years ago, but it's only just now got the attention of the public. It's only now just got public attention. So Afua Hirsch shared that on Tuesday, yesterday. It's now been shared, or it's been viewed 3 million times. So only now is the pressure coming up. I didn't know, obviously I didn't notice that 2 years ago. I didn't see that going viral on social media. As far as I can tell, Ferrari has still never apologized. In the Independent's write-up of that video today, they say both Sky and LBC are yet to comment on what we just saw there. Aaron, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's disgusting. He shouldn't be working in the media if that's what he thinks. If a person of colour says, I have an issue with a particular feature of this country, which, as Afua rightly says, I'm sure Nick Ferrari finds many things sort of displeasurable about Britain. Nobody would say, well, you should piss off then. And the reason why people don't say that to him is because he's white. I think it's astonishing. If Nick Ferrari's not going to apologise for it, if Sky's not going to apologise for it, then they've got no credibility on the issue. I don't think Keir Starmer should be doing things on LBC with Nick Ferrari if you want to apologise for it. He's a racist. If he's not going to apologise for that, Nick Ferrari is a racist. If Sky aren't going to apologise for that, they are giving a platform happily to racists. Not good enough. Really not good enough. You can give all the funding you want and the public relations, which Sky have done. But if you're not doing it on the thing that matters as a media company, your content, you're failing.
Someone else who should apologise, and who's, again, what's ridiculous here is how overdue this is, right? This was 2 years ago. Obviously, Afua Hirsch found it very upsetting, but the issue didn't get any traction. And we've seen over and over again that racism is completely acceptable in our mainstream press. And one place where it is acceptable over and over again is in the Times, Britain's paper of record. So in Monday's Times, this isn't something that's just been unearthed. This was this week. Melanie Phillips wrote a column under the headline, "We're giving in to the race revolutionaries." Now, it's already, a headline that begs a lot of questions, but let's go to what was actually in the article because it's worse. Can we get up this quote? So, yet, having been inculcated with the unchallenged belief that they are victims of white society, black people believe that any disadvantage they may suffer is not the result of bad luck, circumstances beyond anyone's control, or perish the thought, their own behavior, but must be the product of white racism. So that's Melanie Phillips, regular columnist at the Times, in Britain's paper of record, right after a Black Lives Matter movement, which is putting racial justice, at the top of the political agenda, and she thinks it's acceptable, and the Times thinks it's acceptable. I think I think we should focus on the institutions, not the individuals, because I don't think Melanie Phillips would mind if you called her racist. But the paper of record should be held to higher standards, right? And this idea, she's saying that black people believe that any disadvantage they may suffer is not the result of bad luck, circumstances beyond anyone's control, or perish the thought, their own behavior. So she's basically saying all black people think they're victims of racism, when actually the reason they have disadvantages in society is because they didn't bother to work hard enough. There were some changes to it. So the Times did realize that they probably had crossed a line here, but they were really minor. So where it originally said black people believe that any disadvantage they may suffer is not the result of bad luck or their own behavior, etc., it's changed to too many black people believe that. So the concession they've made is that instead of saying all black people, they're saying too many black people have this sort of victim complex where they think that any misfortune is because of racism, which obviously is dismissing the fact that racism is significant in this country, and they removed perish the thought, presumably because they thought it was just too dismissive and awful. The Times also had a leader today that was basically a commentary on the statues, and I was sort of expecting them to say, let's be careful about figures like Winston Churchill who have complex histories, etc., etc. But no, they decided to do an outright defense of basically slavery and colonialism, saying at the time everyone thought it was fine. So we shouldn't judge people by today's standards. So they were basically saying that people like Rhodes, they should stay up because everyone thought at the time colonialism was spreading civilization. So who are we to judge? Aaron, what do you make of that Phillips comment piece? And I suppose, what the Times deems to be acceptable. Obviously a Murdoch-owned paper, like he's someone who's used to publishing, out and out awful racism, but that's supposed to be, an establishment, middle-class intellectual outlet.
Well, she's not alone. If you think of the Sunday Times, Rod Liddell, there's a range of sort of figures like this, Giles Corran. But I think the fact she's been quoted at length by Anders Breivik probably tells you, what you need to know about the content of our politics. But what I find interesting again is that, like, Darren Grimes, like Nick Ferrari, these aren't kind of crazed political figures on the sort of periphery of our conversation as a country. she's on the BBC every week. You know, she goes on BBC Question Time. She'll be on the Daily Politics and so on. And again, she's a really racist lady. You know, she was the lady that coined the term Londonistan, I think in the mid-2000s. She will quite actively say that Muslims aren't welcome in Europe. She says it probably a bit more explicitly than Douglas Murray. So, you know, she's got views which I wouldn't really say fit in a sort of a free democratic society. But she seems to be fine. She seems to be immune from any criticism. And what's interesting is she wrote for The Times. She wrote for, I think she still writes the Jewish Chronicle. You know, these are publications which have called out racism in the Labour Party. Some people will agree on whether or not. I would say that their level of criticism is inadequate to the scale of the problem. People can disagree about that. But surely we can all agree that somebody who says this shouldn't be writing for those very same publications. Really just stinks.
We're going to move to our final story of the evening. Momentum was created in the wake of Jeremy Corbyn's election to become Labour leader. It became a press bogeyman for a while. Everything was blamed on Momentum. But then in the 2017 election, it proved itself as Labour's most valuable player. It had a huge impact on social media and on the ground in marginal constituencies. It did so again in 2019, although obviously the result of that election was more disappointing than the one in 2017. The organisation backed Rebecca Long-Bailey in the most recent Labour leadership election. But now that Keir Starmer has won, it will need to find a new role. And that will be decided in elections which are taking place, or ballots will be dropping next week. And, you know, who wins here will have a big impact on the future direction of the left. There are different strategies at play. And specifically, there are two slates which have formed in recent months, who are both vying to, you know, win these seats to the National Coordinating Group of Momentum, which will set the direction of the organisation. On Novara Media, we're going to have proper hustings next Tuesday. So we'll debate all the concrete issues, all their different visions of what should happen in the organisation. But first, this evening, we're going to have a quick intro, a quick preview of that longer debate next week. And I have a guest from both of those slates. So Lawrence Dunn is on the Momentum Renewal slate. Thank you for joining us this evening, Lawrence.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
And Harriet Profero-Soltani is on the Forward Momentum slate. Harriet?
Hi, Michael.
We've had you actually before on Novara, but I'm going to be unbiased. You don't have to have come on FM to get good treatments. Both are standing to represent the Northwest and Wales. I mean, what I really want to get out of you tonight is why our audience should mind which one of you win, right? Because I know that most of our audience, a large proportion of them, will be persuaded that Momentum is a central organisation in terms of determining how the Labour left sort of organises, how it sees itself, how it sees its relationship to the current Labour leadership over the next 4 years, I suppose. But Momentum Renewal and Forward Momentum, from those two names, you can't really gather what's different about you. So I'm going to go actually to Harriet first, because I know that Forward Momentum sort of founded itself first. They were the first platform to launch themselves. Harriet, why do you think, or why did Forward Momentum come to be?
So Forward Momentum came to be through conversations in the grassroots. We wanted to have those conversations all across the country, speaking to different individuals and trying to work out where they think the movement should go. And I got involved in this campaign because I think we desperately need to see reform of Momentum, both at a strategic point of view in terms of our goals and our aims, but also for the members. I want to have a genuine say over the organisation. And right now, I don't feel like I do. I can give you a really concrete example, right? So, for example, I have to stand on a slate with members in the Northwest, right? Where apparently Wales and the Northwest are one tiny example where in this, and Scotland sits in a region which is like Humber International, it's like a massive amorphous constituency. It's absolutely wild. But in that, obviously, there's going to be a conversation about democracy. And I think that for us in Forward Momentum, the absolute key points for us is about taking these issues seriously. And what we've done so far is putting that into practice by having, a democratic primary, meetings all across the country, running a listening campaign, creating a policy platform, by the members and then voted on by the members. So this is something even from like the get-go, Forward Momentum was thinking about the structures that Momentum needs going forward and putting that into practice, like showing that we stand by those values. So that's what we've been doing so far. You can see all of our proposals. We've got 5 key pledges. You can see them on the website, but I'll very, very quickly go through them. The first one is uniting the socialist left to transform the Labour Party. Second one, refound momentum and put members in charge. Third one, build power in our workplaces and communities. Fourth, give more power and control to groups, regions and nations. And fifth, campaign for a just and green response to COVID. So, you know, we've done the democracy. We've researched this all across the country. And now we've built this platform on behalf of members, by members, so people can know exactly what we stand for.
So, Lawrence, I mean, we've heard from that Forward Momentum was kind of founded to promote more democracy in Momentum. I kind of presume you're not, you know, openly campaigning against democracy in Momentum. So, mate, could you explain sort of what the thinking is behind Momentum Renewal, where you're coming from, how your vision for the organisation differs from the platform that Forward Momentum are putting forward?
Well, our platform is very much based around change as well, and recognising the issues that Momentum has had over the last 5 years and since it was founded. And looking to address those issues, but also looking forward into the future to recognise that the political sands have shifted significantly for the left in the Labour Party and across the Labour movement. So our platform is very much about putting members at the heart of decision making, giving members a say over big political and strategic decisions that Momentum takes. It's very much about strengthening the link between Momentum and the trade union movement to not only sort of, you know, consult with each other over policy and things, but actually get our members and activists actively involved in the trade union movement, educating them on how to get involved in the trade union movement, so we can actually build militant lefts, or help to build militant lefts within the trade union movement to complement the left we're trying to build within the Labour Party. It's about giving local groups control over the way they operate, and also giving them the resources to be able to do the things that they believe they need to do within their communities to make the left relevant and socialism relevant within their communities. Ultimately, my background's as a trade unionist, but I've come into this race and I've stood as a candidate alongside some brilliant candidates. Matthew Brown, the architect of the Preston model, you know, other candidates, Jasmine, Lottie, some fantastic candidates. I've come into this race because actually I'm really worried at the moment that with the direction the left has taken since the election defeat and since the leadership, we lost the leadership election and the NEC elections, that actually there is a real threat that if we don't get a handle on this, that we will slip into the relevancy, and that will mean actually disaster to the class that we claim to represent. So ultimately, we're about trying to forge those links with the members and with the community to argue for socialism within the Labour Party and keep the leadership's feet to the fire with respect to the policy programme that we want the Labour Party to adopt.
Great. I mean, I think probably from what I've seen on social media, and I'm gonna host the hustings next Tuesday at 6 p.m. And I didn't know that we were planning to do this, but I'm in quite a good position to do so because I tweeted on Twitter that I'm going to vote for half of both of your slates where I am in London, because I feel like you're both talking quite a lot of sense. But it seems like there's a bit of a difference of emphasis between Forward Momentum sort of talking about grassroots democracy, potentially lots of direct democracy. Obviously, you had a primary to decide who would be on your slate, and Momentum Renewal, who are sort of emphasizing more that link to the trade unions and the sort of the democratic structures of the trade unions. Is that do you both accept that distinction?
No, I definitely don't. Well, just to like go over the point about why I think that we are different, because there'll be many people watching and listening thinking they sound exactly the same. I think the key point is that Momentum Renewal have some great candidates, no doubt. However, a number of Momentum Renewal candidates have been part of the leadership for the last few years. And I'm really glad that as a result of our campaign, they're now coming around to the idea that democracy is important and we need to build power in workplaces and communities. But Momentum needs new leadership with a new vision for the organisation and a serious commitment to democracy and empowering our members. We can't have the same thing over again. And there are members of the slate who have been sat on the NCG previously. How is it going to be any different? This is the big question. But on the trade union issue, I'm a trade unionist myself, and this is like a really, really key thing for me. And I think going forwards, we've been endorsed by the FBU and many trade unionists are involved in our campaign. So first of all, I don't agree with that distinction, Michael. But more broadly, like we've got the opportunity now, the amount of Momentum numbers who are in the age demographic, who are not in trade unions is a really important point, right? This is something that I'm considering a lot, that like I'm 26 and most of my friends aren't in trade unions. I would be really passionate as a member of the NCG to try and educate Momentum members who might not be in unions about why they need to join a trade union and what a trade union can do for them. So yeah, I completely disagree with what you said, Michael. I could talk about it at length, but I know my comrade Andrew is going to be doing that in your hustings next week.
Yeah, so we're going to have the proper husting. You're going to get the final word, Lawrence. I'm not. Yeah. You both get 2 points each. Those hustings will be at 6 p.m. tomorrow, so we'll get down into the deep issues of how you differ. But first, I'm going to throw back to you, Lawrence. The implication was that you don't really want to renew Momentum. You're almost Momentum continuity. Do you accept that?
No, I absolutely don't accept that. I wouldn't have entered into this race if I was continuity anything. I've stood as a candidate because I believe Momentum needs to change. Harriet talked about, obviously, for Momentum's process for selecting their candidates, which I absolutely respect, but everyone's got to acknowledge that that process has produced a slate in the northwestern Wales, which means that large swathes of the northwestern Wales are not represented, and key areas for Momentum. There's no candidate from Lancashire. There's no candidate from Manchester, where huge swathes of Momentum membership is. Democracy is more than just about giving people a vote. It's actually making sure that your representation is right across the different areas that you claim to represent. That's just my son in the background. Say hello, everyone. And to be honest as well, when Harriet was talking about the conversations that have happened across the country, I've been organising in the second largest Labour majority in the country, Knowsley, for the last couple of years. I was never approached by anyone from Forward Momentum about this conversation. So, you know, there has been conversations that I've had with comrades about how Momentum needs to change, and we're absolutely committed to bringing about that change. Some more decision making delegated to members, some more resources out to local Momentum groups. And the key thing for me, key part of my policy platform, is about establishing those proper formal links with the trade union movement to build the left within the trade union movement. So actually our members in the Labour Party and in Momentum are tackling capitalism as its root, which is the workplace, and that's what we want to do.
All right, I think that's a great introduction to where the lay of the land, where the conflict might be. We'll go much deeper next Tuesday at 6 p.m. For now, Harriet and Lawrence, thank you both so much for joining me this evening.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Michael.
Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, Harriet.
Thank you.
Harriet and Lawrence are both standing in the Wales and North West section of the Momentum NCG. One reason why we did that sort of intro to the debate tonight is that the freeze date for when you can join to vote Momentum vote in that election, is tomorrow at, I think, 11 a.m. So if you want to watch those hustings next Tuesday and have a bit of a stake in it, you know, have the feeling that after you watch it, whichever side you think made the best argument, you can vote for them. Then you've got, I suppose, less than 24 hours, potentially less than about 14 hours to join the organisation. That is it for us this evening. Thank you, everyone, for your super chats tonight. Thank you so much for Aaron Bastani for standing in at the last minute. You would never know because he's so fluent on all the issues, even if they've just been presented to him at the very last minute. We'll be back on Friday at 8 p.m. So make sure to hit subscribe, and please do become a Novara Media supporter. If you are not already, to do that, you go to novaramedia.com/support. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.